The hangar was empty except for one old man until the sound of engines changed everything. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the air still smelled of jet fuel and wet concrete. The massive hangar doors stood open to the runway beyond, letting in a thin morning light that made the steel beams glisten. It was the kind of day when nothing special was scheduled, at least that's what the airbase roster said. Inside, one man stood alone. He wasn't wearing a uniform. No ID badge hung from his neck. Just a faded bomber jacket worn at the seams and a pair of boots that had clearly walked farther than most people drove in a month. His hair was silver, cropped short, his back straight despite the weight of years. He leaned on a railing near the edge of the hangar floor, his eyes fixed on the empty runway. The base personnel who passed through barely noticed him. Some assumed he was a retired mechanic waiting for someone, maybe here to pick up a relative. Others thought he was lost, but no one asked. He didn't move, didn't speak. The man's name, though no one in the hangar knew it, was Daniel Royce. 50 years ago, this place had been different. The hangar smelled of hot oil and salt air. The sound of jet turbines had been constant. Royce had been younger then, wearing a flight suit, preparing to step into an F-4 Phantom. He had taken off from this very runway on missions no official record would confirm. Some over hostile waters, others into airspace where he was never supposed to be. Missions where radio silence wasn't just protocol, it was survival. Now, decades later, he was back. Not as a guest, not as part of a ceremony, and certainly not for recognition. He was just there, waiting. A junior airman named Collins passed by, carrying a clipboard. He glanced at the older man but said nothing. His orders were to prep Hangar 3 for routine maintenance checks. Nothing in those orders mentioned a visitor. Still, something about the man's posture made Collins slow down. It wasn't the stiffness. Lots of older vets stood straight, but the way his eyes stayed locked on the runway, as if expecting something the rest of them couldn't see. Collins opened his mouth to ask if he needed help, but stopped when the man's head turned slightly, just enough for Collins to catch a glimpse of a small patch sewn inside the bomber jacket's collar. It was barely visible, a black rectangle with a silver winged dagger embroidered over it, the kind of patch most people wouldn't recognize. But Collins had seen it once, years ago, in a training slideshow about joint operations history. It belonged to a unit that officially didn't exist anymore. Collins walked away, telling himself it was probably a coincidence. An hour passed. The hangar crew came and went. Mechanics moved tool carts. Forklifts rumbled across the floor. But the old man didn't move, not once. Then, faint at first, came the sound. A low, distant hum carried on the wind. Not the usual training aircraft, deeper, heavier. The old man's head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but his eyes sharpened. The hum grew louder, the tone shifting into a layered roar. Collins looked toward the runway. Nothing yet. Just a shimmer of heat above the tarmac. The man shifted his weight off the railing, standing fully upright now. His left hand rested lightly against the seam of his jacket, as if feeling for something inside. In 1974, Royce had stood in a similar position, different hangar, different country, waiting for a squadron that was never supposed to return. Against the odds, they had, battered and low on fuel, wheels touching down in silence to avoid radar. Today felt the same. The roar deepened. The shimmer on the horizon broke into shapes, dark silhouettes cutting through the mist. 1, 2, 3, 4. Collins froze. Those weren't standard trainers. They were combat aircraft, an entire squadron of them, and they were coming in tight formation. Around the hangar, people started to notice. Mechanics stepped out from under wings, wiping their hands on rags. Officers paused mid-conversation. And the old man. He simply took one step forward, closer to the open hangar doors. The lead aircraft banked slightly, its landing gear lowering in perfect synchronization with the rest of the formation. The sound hit the hangar like a physical force, vibrating through the steel beams. Collins found himself glancing between the jets and the old man, wondering if he was the reason they were here. And then something happened that wasn't in any schedule, wasn't in any protocol. The entire formation adjusted their approach, just a few degrees, aligning perfectly with the hangar where the old man stood. The air filled with the roar of engines and the smell of burning jet fuel. The ground trembled. The old man didn't flinch. As the first aircraft crossed the runway threshold, its pilot did something no one expected. The lead jet dipped its nose ever so slightly, not toward the control tower, not toward the reviewing stand on the far side of the runway, but directly toward the hangar doors where Daniel Royce stood. It was a subtle gesture, almost invisible to those who didn't know what to look for. But for those who did, it was unmistakable. A salute. One by one, the jets touched down, tires screeching against the wet tarmac, wings shimmering with the heat of their engines. The entire squadron rolled down the runway in perfect unison, before peeling toward the taxiway that ran along the hangar line. Instead of turning toward the standard parking positions, the lead aircraft slowed and stopped directly in front of Hangar 3. The others followed, forming a tight line like an honor guard made of steel and fire. The roar of engines dropped to a low growl. Canopies hissed open. Pilots climbed out. And that's when Collins realized something was very, very different about this arrival. The first pilot down, tall, lean, still wearing his oxygen mask, walked toward the hangar without removing his helmet. The others followed, forming a loose semicircle around Royce. No words, no orders. The pilot finally removed his helmet, revealing close-cropped dark hair and eyes that locked onto the old man with an intensity that cut through the noise around them. "Sir," the pilot said, his voice carrying over the distant rumble of the idling engines, "permission to stand with you." Royce said nothing at first. His gaze moved from the young pilot to the rest of the squadron. Then he nodded once. Collins watched, stunned, as each pilot approached in turn, shaking Royce's hand, some briefly embracing him. It wasn't casual, it wasn't routine. It was respect, the kind that can't be faked and can't be ordered. A crew chief from the lead aircraft stepped forward, holding something in both hands, a weathered olive-drab flight helmet, the kind no one had used in decades. The chief offered it to Royce like it was made of glass. "We kept it, sir. Thought it should come home." Royce took it, his fingers tracing the faded name stenciled on the side. Lieutenant Daniel Royce. The image hit Collins like a flash. He'd seen that name before, buried in a training manual footnote about a classified rescue mission in the late 70s. The details had been redacted, but the summary line had stayed with him. Squadron extraction under hostile fire. All pilots returned. Royce had been the one flying cover that day, outnumbered, outgunned, and told not to expect rescue himself, but he'd stayed until the last plane was safely clear. The pilots didn't speak of it now. They didn't need to. Every one of them had read the mission file in their own training, the kind that gets passed down like folklore in squadrons. And now, here he was, not in a ceremony, not for an award, but standing quietly in the same place he had once launched into the unknown. The lead pilot took a step closer. "We just wanted you to know. We haven't forgotten." Royce smiled faintly. "Good. Because neither have I." The pilot stepped back, forming a line once more. They saluted. Royce returned it, his arm steady, his eyes sharp. Then, without another word, they turned, boarded their jets, and one by one rolled back onto the runway. Engines roared, wheels lifted, and the squadron climbed into the sky until they were nothing but specks against the clouds. The hangar fell silent again. Royce stood there for a moment, the old helmet still in his hands, before placing it gently on the railing. Collins finally found his voice. "Sir, why didn't anyone know you were coming?" Royce looked at him, a hint of a smile still on his face. because I wasn't here for them to know. I was here for them to remember. He turned, walking slowly toward the hangar's side door, boots echoing on the concrete. And just like that, he was gone. Some men don't need a ceremony to be honored. Some legacies live in the quiet spaces between missions, carried forward not in speeches, but in the way others choose to remember. If you've ever known someone like Daniel Royce, share their name in the comments. Let's make sure the world never forgets the ones who stood their ground so others could make it home.